Welcome back. Today, the ANC is celebrating its 112th birthday. The ruling party commemorates this in Mpumalanga alongside the delivery of its annual January 8th statement, where President Cyril Ramaphosa will be outlining the party's plans for the year. The statement is crucial for the ANC as it comes ahead of that highly anticipated 2024 elections. Joining me now as we assess the nation's political landscape ahead of the elections is political analyst Asanda Ngoasheng. Asanda, thank you so much for joining us today and a happy new year to you. Now, it seems like the ANC's tasks of positioning the 2024 statement is a complicated one. There's hardly any angle, any spin or tactic that hasn't been used before within these January 8 statements. Just how important is this week's one?
Thank you so much for having me. I think that, this is one of the most important January 8 statements. We are seeing the ANC arriving at 112 years of existence. At the same time, we are 30 years into the post-democratic era of South Africa. And so it's a good opportunity for the ANC to recount the gains that have been made since we got out of the system of apartheid, and to reiterate to people some of the wins and what they've managed to do in those 30 years. However, they are a little bit distracted at the moment because you've got the MK and you've got a whole host of new smaller parties that are vying for their share of the political vote. And I think that, it's probably one of the most competitive elections that the ANC is going into. And so they have to affirm those who have voted for them in the last elections, and they have to figure out how to attract those who either are sitting on the fence or who are still undecided about who they're going to vote for in the upcoming election.
Now, sticking with that, Asanda, Secretary General Fikile Mbalula said the address will focus on crime, on corruption, as well as that ongoing electricity crisis. Now, these are issues that have plagued the country for many, many years. Now, do you think enough will be said to instill some sort of confidence within the ruling party?
I think, the ANC suffers from, in some ways, having created a monster, which is Jacob Zuma, and now being unable to deal with that monster, because the very corruption that has plagued the ANC is something that previously existed before Jacob Zuma, but blew up or literally became out of control during the tenure of Jacob Zuma. And now you have the same Jacob Zuma going around and talking about, how problematic the ANC is, and making all kinds of criticisms when he knows that he was at the center of some of the reasons why South Africans stopped voting for Jacob, the ANC. And I think if you look at even the rise of the EFF, for example, that political party happened to be successful in part because people were protesting against an ANC with President Jacob Zuma at the helm. And so what we're seeing now, unfortunately, it's quite destabilizing, but it's actually sadly quite normal for an African country that 30 years after liberation, there's high competition, that 30 years after liberation, the political party that initially, was at the forefront of the liberation struggle becomes a series of broken up, thousands, essentially shards or pieces of its original unit. We've seen this in every African continent, in every African country across the continent. Same with, the strategy that Jacob Zuma is using now, which is to use his power, use what is left of his popularity to try and build, I think, a political party for his son, essentially. We've seen this happen in the DRC. We've seen this happen in Angola, for example. You've got the former president's daughter only having their accounts frozen and in some ways being held accountable for the corruption that was seen in her father's tenure. And so there is nothing new that Jacob Zuma is doing, that the MK political party is doing, or that is happening within the ANC. And in fact, President Thabo Mbeki himself said at least 10 years ago that the ANC's biggest threat is not external, it's internal. And that the biggest threat that the ANC has is if it was to fracture into the formation that were already very clear during his tenure, and that he was doing his best to try and kind of pull together. And I think, what South Africans need to also remember is that South Africa is not the ANC. The ANC is a political party in South Africa. And just like any other political party, it can cease to exist. That is not a thing that means the end of this country. And I think if we hold on to that and if we remember that, then we really will be able to pull through this, because ultimately, the vote, whether you're talking about the vote or you're talking about the future of South Africa, it's not about the politicians. It's about South Africans and how we respond to this uncertainty that the ANC and its various fractions have and continue to cause.
Now, Asanda, I want us to just zoom in on what's currently happening in Mpumalanga. As you mentioned that all of the ANC's problem, well, most of them are quite internal. It's all these internal misunderstandings where we start seeing a breakaway, right? We've seen what happened with the EFF and how much of a threat it's posed to the ANC when it comes to elections. Now that we have Jacob Zuma with the MK party, as you mentioned, it is nothing new. Is it that the ANC doesn't necessarily care what's happening? Because it doesn't seem like it's addressing what's happening internally. Recently, we just saw what happened with ANC member Mavuso Msimang. It doesn't seem like these internal issues are actually being dealt with.
I don't think that the ANC is capable of dealing with the internal issues because they have become endemic. So they've become part of the fabric. They've become part of the institution that is the African National Congress. And so if you heard Fikile Mbalula's own statements about the ways in which the ANC itself, in its desire to keep Jacob Zuma, lied and obfuscated facts. I mean, he was joking about the fact that they started calling a swimming pool a fire pool. And I thought, it's so sad that it took Jacob Zuma basically backstabbing the ANC for the ANC to start telling the truth about the kind of man that he is. But I still think, that one thing that South Africans need to focus on is the fact that the politicians within and outside of the ANC are playing what's called a zero-sum game, which is either winner takes all or mutual destruction. And I think that it's going to be mutual destruction in that if the MK wins some votes away from the ANC, it weakens the ANC. And if the ANC will retain likely a lot of votes, in the sense that the ANC is likely, if it loses, it's going to definitely still be a big player, in that it's going to become probably one of the biggest opposition political parties, assuming that then a coalition government between the smaller parties comes to the fore. But what this does is that it's something that's good for South African democracy, in that for the first time we are moving away from a state where we have a democracy where it is technically a one-party state, because it's a given that before these elections, everybody knew what's going to happen in the elections. The ANC is going to win. And that's why we saw high apathy with people choosing not to vote if they were unhappy with the ANC, or voting as a protest against ANC. And so what is happening at the moment gives us the opportunity as South Africans to vote for who we think can take us into the future. And the dissolution of the ANC by its own sword is actually one of the best things to happen to South Africa, because it gives South Africans a chance to decide the kind of leadership that they want. It gives South Africans the opportunity to chart a different future that says 30 years after democracy, 30 years after we began to deal with the scourge of apartheid, where are we standing, and what kind of future do we want for ourselves and for our children, essentially?
Asanda,
and that is what we need to focus on.
Asanda, unfortunately, we've run out of time. We could talk about this for hours. It would be interesting to see how this plays out, and we'll definitely catch up with you in the run-up to elections. And that was political analyst Asanda Ngoasheng.